Tonight is a slow walk into a part of the Scarlet Forest that smells sweet before it smells foul. Not the river first, not the web-hung branches, not even the red water, the honey. Somewhere under the canopy, where the air sits warm and wet and thick enough to feel almost chewable, there are places in this forest where sweetness gathers. Honey in quantity, mushrooms in shade, fruit going soft on the ground, damp rot working quietly underneath all of it. The Scarlet Forest is full of life, but some corners of it are richer than others, and rich places rarely stay peaceful for long. This is where Congalala begins to make sense. Because Congalala is not the kind of monster that feels shaped by elegance. It is not a perfect hunter, not a graceful climber, not the sort of animal that survives by restraint. It is a large fanged beast built around appetite, opportunism, and the simple ecological truth that in a wet, productive forest, the least picky animal is often one of the hardest to starve. If one follows the river out of the windward plains and keeps moving until the air stops tasting of dust and starts tasting of wet bark, ferment, and flowers, one eventually enters the Scarlet Forest properly. A red, watered rainforest of towering trees, dense plant life, old ruins, hanging roots, and seasonal flooding. A place that does not merely get wet, it saturates. During the downpour, the forest floods so thoroughly that the balance of power shifts toward animals built for water, and the whole region becomes a different country than it was the day before. Paths disappear, ground softens, shallows become channels. Things that were merely damp become submerged, and whatever lives here has to be flexible enough to survive that change, or stubborn enough to keep feeding anyway. The forest also holds a great many webs spun by Lala Barina, scarlet threads strung where the eye notices them only a little too late, and of special importance here, an area thick with honey where Congalala and Conga are known to dwell. The woodward themselves describe one such beast as a big creature ruining their honey mountain, which tells you two things at once. First, Congalala is not an occasional wanderer here. Second, in the Scarlet Forest, it is tied to rich feeding sites, not just travel routes or random chance. It goes where the forest is already concentrating value. That matters, because Congalala is not built like a dedicated pursuit predator or a strict herbivore. It is a large fanged beast recorded since the second generation of guild hunting records, and older ecological notes describe it consistently as an omnivorous, ape-like animal that wanders widely in search of food, only settling into territorial behavior when it finds a region rich enough to be worth holding. That general pattern remains true across its many recorded habitats, and now, in more recent surveys, the Scarlet Forest and even the ruins of Wyveria. The important thing is not just that it can live in many places. The important thing is what kind of places those are. Again and again, the records place it in warm, humid, food-rich environments, usually where mushrooms are plentiful and where mixed diets are an advantage rather than a liability. Congalala is tied less to one prey species than to abundance itself, to the kind of environment where something is always ripening, rotting, fermenting, crawling, dripping, or going unwatched for long enough to be stolen. Physiologically, the creature has always been described in broad, almost insulting terms. An enormous, pink-furred, tailed, gorilla-like beast with a broad head, a black underbelly, long claws on the forelimbs, and a pale blonde patch or crest of a hair on top. In the Forbidden Lands, it has even been noted to wear its fur more shaggily than its smaller relatives, with long pink curtains hanging from the arms and making the whole body look less groomed, less disciplined, and somehow even more indecently comfortable in its own mess. At first glance, it sounds like the sort of monster nature invents after a joke has gone on too long. But the body tells you more than the joke does. A broad head means room for strong jaw muscles and a wide bite. Long foreclaws mean tearing, digging, hauling, and swiping more than delicate grasping. A heavy trunk and thick limbs mean the body is built to push through brush and undergrowth without caring very much whether the undergrowth approves. And then there is the tail. Older ecological notes say Congalala uses the tail to hold and carry food while fighting or moving, which gives it a strange advantage for a beast that otherwise looks built for blunt force. The claws are not the finest tools in the forest. The jaws are better for crushing than for careful handling. But the tail gives it something like a third hand, and separate notes also remark on Congalala having opposable thumbs, which explains why it can exploit more varied resources than its silhouette first suggests. So, although it looks like a glutton first and an animal second, its body is actually very efficient for the kind of life it leads. A brute, yes, but a brute with reach, a forager with enough dexterity to matter. It can strip food from awkward places, carry while moving, hold what it wants a little longer than another beast might manage. That matters in a forest where the best foods are not always lying politely on the ground. The tail is one of the clearest examples of that usefulness. Congalala's claws are long and excellent for swiping, tearing, and general violence, but they are not ideal for careful grip. Earlier physiology notes even point this out directly. The claws are too long to make fine handling easy, so the body compensates elsewhere. The tail has evolved a leathery, dexterous tip, effectively turning it into a third arm. That means the same animal that looks like a blunt, pink battering ram can also hold mushrooms, carry food, and manage objects with a degree of control its forelimbs alone would not allow. The claws tear, the jaws crush. The tail keeps hold of what matters. Its most famous anatomical feature is not the jaw, though, nor the claws, nor even the huge belly that so often becomes the center of hunter jokes. It is the crest. Wilds era records are especially helpful here, because they say plainly that the distinct crest is shaped by males using plant oils and juices as a sign of virility. Older notes describe the same structure as hair smoothed into shape to signify that the beast is the pack leader, and other preserved ecology summaries go further still, describing that bright hair arrangement as a socially legible mark of status, maintained deliberately with plant juices and grooming. Put together, the picture is simple. The crest is not horn, not bone, not some rigid structure grown once and left alone. It is display hair, maintained, read by others, a visible signal of maturity, condition, and dominance. When you see a Congalala carrying that polished, ridiculous plume, you are looking at status made visible. And the crest is not only a sign of rank once it exists, it is part of how rank is claimed in the first place. Older ecology notes describe a very specific ritual around it. When a male conger grows strong enough to imagine itself above the rest, it begins shaping its head fur with juices from crushed plants and fruits, often drawn from foods it already favors. As the juices dry, the hair hardens into that familiar conical plume. In other words, the crown is made before the throne is won. That matters because it turns the crest into a public statement rather than a private condition. It says challenge before the challenge is physically finished. The body announces what it wants to become, and then the rest of the group responds to that announcement. The straighter and longer the cone, the more respect it seems to command, which makes the whole thing feel less like ornament and more like ritualized politics carried out through grooming. The detail that only the second and third ranked members are allowed to issue such a challenge makes it even better. It suggests that even in a species this loose and food-driven, there are still limits on who is permitted to posture upward. A lower-ranked conger styling its hair without the right standing is not treated as ambitious. It is treated as improper and attacked accordingly. That gives the species a kind of rough social order without making it feel disciplined in the wolfish sense. Status exists, procedure exists, but both still rest on force in the end. And that brings us naturally to the question of social structure. Because the older image of the species makes it sound quite clean. Congalala as the leader of Conga. Conga as the smaller followers. A rough troop built around one obvious adult male. The newer picture is messier. Wilde's era Conga records describe their groups as typically consisting of females and juveniles. An adult Congalala may occasionally be sighted among them, but these beasts are described as non-social enough not to establish a true chain of command. That one detail changes the whole feel of the species, because it suggests that Congalala is not the disciplined commander of some orderly troop. It is something looser than that, a dominant adult presence attached to a feeding group, a dangerous male tolerated or obeyed when food is rich enough to make that arrangement worthwhile. A beast whose size, crest, and aggression influence others without creating the kind of neat hierarchy people often imagine when they hear the word pack. And Conga themselves help clarify that picture. On their own, they are pink-furred, fanged beasts of warm, humid places, usually living in small groups rather than large troops, and just as fond of mushrooms as Congalala itself. They are aggressive when disturbed, known for charging, swiping, body slamming, and using their own rancid flatulence as a deterrent. In miniature, they already contain the whole unpleasant blueprint. Congalala simply scales it upward. More size, more confidence, more chemistry, more willingness to hold ground when the food is worth the effort. That means the sociality here is probably best understood as practical rather than affectionate. A feeding group, a cluster of related or familiar bodies staying near abundance. Females and juveniles at the core, and sometimes a larger adult male attaching himself to that cluster, not as a commander in the disciplined sense, but as a physically convincing fact around which the rest of the group adjusts. That fits the rest of the ecology beautifully. Congalala are nomads when food is poor, proprietors when food is rich, opportunists in almost every circumstance. Their feeding biology is the next essential piece. Wilds records call them big eaters and stress that they love mushrooms to the point that they absorb what they consume and then exhale a variety of potent breaths. Older records say much the same thing in plainer terms. Congalala are ravenous, especially fond of mushrooms, and the character of their breath changes with what they have eaten. That relationship between meal and emission is one of the most stable facts preserved about the species. Poison, paralysis, sleep, blast, and in some older records, even outright flame, all produced after consuming the right material. The important thing here is the blueprint. Congalala does not merely digest, it weaponizes digestion. That is not a trivial gimmick. It is a real chemical ecology. A forest like the Scarlet Forest does not only provide calories, it provides compounds. Fungi ferment, nectar-rich matter, decaying plant tissue, insects, strange growths thriving in damp shade. Most animals consume these things only as food. Congalala consumes them as raw material for what comes next. The meal becomes breath. The environment becomes deterrent. The digestive part is more specific than it first sounds. Older notes describe Congalala's stomach as having powerful enzymes capable of separating plant-based toxins and turning them into gases that can later be expelled through the mouth. That gives the whole breath system a more believable biological shape. It is not magic mushroom roulette. It is a digestive chemistry built to sort, process, and reuse the dangerous parts of what the animal eats. Curiously, the same notes say those enzymes do not neutralize poisons bound to flesh, which is why poisoned meat can still affect Congalala normally. That is a wonderful detail because it makes the system feel limited instead of perfect. The beast is adapted to its usual ecological tricks, not immune to every poison in the world. There is another useful layer here too. In the Scarlet Forest, Congalala is reportedly able to make special use of a rare black truffle that gives its breath multiple foul properties at once. That is exactly the kind of regional detail that makes the species feel alive in wilds rather than merely carried over from older records. The forest is not just another green backdrop for an old monster. It changes what the monster is capable of expressing. And then, of course, there is the more famous part of Congalala's chemistry, the flatulence. It would be easy to write it off as comic relief, but ecologically it makes perfect sense. Congalala is a large omnivore that lives around rot, mushrooms, fermentation, and rich food sources. A foul, gaseous deterrent is not only believable, it is efficient. It creates distance. It discourages pursuit. It punishes things bold enough to close without fully committing to a lethal encounter. And in wilds, Conga themselves are explicitly noted to use that same terrible flatulence against perceived threats, which tells you this is not some isolated trick of the larger male. It is part of the lineage's shared way of being unbearable. Even its warning behavior fits that same logic. When provoked, Congalala does not always begin with immediate impact. Older notes describe a species-wide threat display first. The beast rises onto its hind legs, spreads its arms, shakes its belly, and releases a smaller cloud of rancid gas as if offering one last chance for the disagreement to end at a distance. It is almost theatrical in its own ugly way. Not graceful, certainly, but deliberate. Only after that does the heavier violence begin. And there is more body hidden in that behavior too. Congalala can inflate its belly and use it almost like a shield, with the hardened skin of its naked abdomen deflecting certain attacks. That detail is easy to laugh at until you think about what it means. A body already built around gluttony and gas has found a way to turn its own swollen front into temporary protection. It is not elegant, but it is efficient, in the same way the rest of Congalala is efficient. Use what you already have. Turn excess into advantage. The cost is that it leaves the beast winded afterward, which again makes the system feel real. That makes it especially well suited to the Scarlet Forest. Because the Scarlet Forest is not a clean, simple pantry. It is a layered one. Wet rot below, fruit above, honey in pockets, mushrooms wherever damp and shade agree to keep talking. In a place like that, a generalist with a chemically expressive gut becomes much harder to predict than a simple grazer or simple predator. And that tells you a great deal about where it sits in the food web. It is not the apex of the Scarlet Forest. That place belongs to Uth Duna. The Scarlet Forest floods during the downpour. Aquatic monsters gain an advantage, and Uth Duna reigns supreme over the ecosystem. A honey-haunting, omnivorous ape may be dangerous, but it is not the flood-sovereign leviathan that rules the wettest season. And Uth Duna is not the only pressure here. The forest also holds Lala Barina, native to the region, with its scarlet silk and neuroplegic florets. Other large monsters move through these same spaces as well, which means Congalala does not live in some quiet, fungal paradise with only herbivores and minor scavengers for company. It shares the forest with web builders, flyers, roaming territorial beasts, and, in season, leviathans that profit from flood. So its niche cannot depend on overpowering everything else. It doesn't. Congalala thrives not by being the strongest thing in the forest, but by being one of the least picky and one of the most chemically obnoxious. In practical terms, its food chain position in the Scarlet Forest is best understood as that of a highly disruptive mid to upper omnivore. It can bully smaller creatures off food, exploit honey-rich and mushroom-rich zones, consume carrion and raid the stores or preferred ingredients of others. Older ecology notes say that when food grows scarce, Congalala may intrude into settlements or into the territories of other large monsters. The implication is not subtle. This is a forager with the confidence of a raider. The Honey Association deserves special attention. Regional records note an area full of honey where Congalala and its pack reside, and the Woodwood grievance about the Honey Mountain fits that pattern perfectly. Honey is a dense energy source, yes, but more importantly, honey-rich places are concentration points in the food web. Insects gather, fruiting plants cluster. Fermentation happens. Mushrooms thrive in the nutrient-rich damp around them. Smaller scavengers and opportunists circle. A creature living around a honey mountain does not just gain access to sweetness. It gains access to convergence. And Congalala is exactly the sort of animal built to benefit from convergence. It does not need to hunt in the heroic sense. It only needs to remain near abundance and weaponize anyone else's reluctance to get close. In a place like the Scarlet Forest, a feeding site occupied by Congalala is probably less dramatic than hunters imagine, and more telling. Not a constant frenzy, not a brawl every second. More often, a heavy kind of ownership, a half-eaten patch of abundance, mushrooms torn up from damp ground, fruit broken open and left to sweeten further in the heat, honey disturbed, dripped, smeared into bark and fur, conga lingering around the edges, close enough to benefit, far enough to avoid a larger body's irritation. That is one of the useful things the smaller beasts add to the picture. They make Congalala feel less like a solitary caricature and more like a species embedded in a real feeding scene. Females and juveniles gather where the food is good. The adult male, when present, does not need to organize them in any elegant sense. It only needs to be larger, fouler, and more convincing. A glance, a shift of weight, a warning grunt, and the best part of the sight remains its part a little longer. There is a kind of ecology in that ugliness. Smaller bodies test the edges of a meal. They learn where tolerance ends. They live off what the richer sight can support without ever becoming orderly around it. And when the peace does break, it probably breaks in the same blunt way the rest of Congalala's life does. A shove, a swipe, a burst of stench. Then stillness again, broken only by chewing. Because the Scarlet Forest is never just one thing at a time, those feeding sites are rarely isolated from the rest of the region's life. Insects gather, smaller scavengers circle. The damp keeps everything ripening, spoiling, or fermenting a little faster than it would elsewhere. So, a Congalala holding ground around honey and mushrooms is not only defending food already found, it is defending the promise of what that place will keep producing tomorrow. That may be the clearest reason such a beast becomes territorial only when abundance is high enough. It is not guarding empty land. It is guarding recurrence. That, more than anything, is why Congalala has remained ecologically believable across so many regions and generations of observation. It is tied to the simple principle that wet, rich environments always produce waste, ripeness, rot, and carelessness. And carelessness is food. Older records reinforce this more than they complicate it. From early on, Congalala has been pink-furred, mushroom-loving, surprisingly dexterous, and marked by that leader's crest. It has long been known for stench, for food-based breaths, for heavy sleeping, for becoming faster and stronger when enraged, for reddening in face and hindquarters, for eating dropped meat in the middle of a fight, for being baited by food, for carrying things in its tail. None of that reads like a monster reinvented for a new era. It reads like a beast the Guild has known for a very long time and continues, grudgingly, to understand more clearly. Even the older variations of the species, though different in color and temperament, preserve the same core logic. Crest, appetite, mushroom chemistry, gas, status display. The details shift, but the life strategy does not. Now, as for the name, it is worth being careful. The archives preserve the English name Congalala and the Japanese name Babaconga, along with titles that emphasize pink fur, beastliness, and leadership. What they do not preserve as cleanly is an officially stated English etymology of the sort attached to some other monsters. So the safest reading is the plainest one. Pink-furred beast. Beast leader. That fits well enough, because there is something almost offensively straightforward about Congalala, once one stops expecting dignity from it. It is a beast of appetite, vanity, scent, and opportunism. The males oil and sculpt their crests. The species loves mushrooms with the devotion of a drunkard to strong brew. It settles near honey. It bullies where it can, wanders when it must, and turns every territorial disagreement into a question of who is willing to endure the other's chemistry. It is intelligent enough to use varied food, social enough to make status visible, and brutish enough to make all of that everyone else's problem. The Scarlet Forest, with its red waters, flood cycles, silk nests, and dense feeding pockets, suits such a creature almost perfectly. Not because it is the greatest beast there, but because it is so well built for the crowded middle of the forest, where every meal must be found, stolen, defended, or scavenged before something bigger arrives. So if you want Congalala's proper place, it is this. In older jungles and in the Scarlet Forest alike, it is the gluttonous middle power. A broad-palmed, pink-furred, crest-grooming raider of rich places. A beast that can live off fruit, fungus, carrion, honey, insects, and theft. A creature that has survived for so long precisely because the forest always produces waste, ripeness, rot, and opportunities for an animal shameless enough to seize them. And if you are listening late at night, you can leave it there now. Somewhere in the Scarlet Forest, the Honey Mountain is still being ruined. Somewhere under wet leaves and heavy air, a feeding site has become temporarily someone else's property. A few smaller pink bodies linger near the sweetness. A larger one sits where the richest part of the find can be watched. The crest is still oiled. The belly is still full. The forest smells sweet until it doesn't. Let it keep its honey. Let it keep its mushrooms. Let it keep the red water and the damp rot and the little territorial wars of the middle ranks. And let the glutton of the forest remain somewhere deeper under the canopy tonight. Good night, hunter.